So in terms of learning objectives, 3 key learning objectives really. First of all, we'll look at some of the physiological underpinnings regarding cold water immersion and provide some context. We'll then go into a little bit more detail in one particular area, which is around this area of muscle perfusion, which is one of the key responses to cold water immersion. And then we'll finish by trying to put some evidence-based prescription in place based on the information that precedes that. So sure, don't need to really kind of explain this to this audience. Obviously, when we talk about cryotherapy, we're really talking about various therapies that come under the umbrella term of cold application. And as you can see here, there are a number of different ways we can do that. Most of you will be familiar, certainly on the injury side over the years, with ice application. But certainly on the performance side, let's call this more in terms of recovery. So if we think about a tournament, for example, where players need to play and recover quickly before they bounce into the next game, so the Arab Cup, which is obviously underway at the moment, typically what we see as probably the most prevalent strategy is cold water immersion, where the athletes obviously immerse the lower limbs in cold water. And that's really the one that we'll really touch upon today. There are others. Some of you will be aware of, for example, whole body cryotherapy, which have really come on the scene in the last few years, where we have these really cold chambers full of cold gas, minus 110, minus 120, and the players will go in there for 2 or 3 minutes. So there are different ways of applying the cooling stimulus, but generally they fall under this umbrella of cryotherapy. So why are we interested in cold water immersions? So probably certainly over the last 10 years been a huge amount of interest in cold water immersion, and here is another example of some research hot off the press, a few Aspetar staff members involved, which is like a global survey that asked practitioners about the areas of the recovery strategies that they use and the perceived effectiveness. And you can see here clearly that cold water therapy still is prevalent. Massive use and also, a lot of perceived effectiveness. So if we think about recovery outside of nutrition and sleep and actually just a day off in terms of general rest, cold water immersion is typically up there in terms of the most used interventions, aside from those core basics of recovery. So it's a real hot topic still, even today in 2021. So before we can go any further, really, to kind of think about, what we might do with cold water immersion, we need to obviously understand a little bit what goes on below the surface. And typically, if we look at some of the mechanisms that are involved in cryotherapy, then often, certainly in the kind of, let's call it performance landscape in recovery, there's kind of 4 key areas. So they kind of here are pictured in terms of tissue temperature, inflammation, kind of nervous system reactivation, and blood flow. So the one we'll really focus on today is blood flow, but I thought it would be useful just to give a little bit of backdrop to the other 3, because they are clearly important in what we're going to discuss. So if we look at tissue temperature, clearly one of the key reasons, or the key reason we apply any cryotherapy strategy, is to reduce tissue temperature. And what I mean by that is core temperature, skin temperature, and really importantly in this context, muscle temperature. And really what we know from the literature, and this is an example of some of the work we published a few years ago in MedSci, is that actually because of its high conductive cooling capacity, water or cold water is a really effective stimulus to cool the tissue. And for example, this is a study here where we compared cold water immersion versus the cryogas chambers that I was just alluding to earlier. So effectively, we got people to exercise, and then during the following exercise, we applied either cold water immersion or we basically put them in one of these cold gas chambers. And the cold water immersion responses are the ones that you can see in the black dots. And so on the left-hand side, skin temperature, and on the right-hand side is muscle temperature. And what you can clearly see is that the cold water immersion is a far more effective strategy at reducing tissue temperature. So we know from many years of the literature that this decline in tissue temperature is really key to driving the effects of cold water immersion. So here we can see obviously the water is far more effective and cheaper than your typical cold air gas chambers. And this was just two really ecologically valid protocols. We applied a 10-minute cold water immersion, and I think it was 3 minutes in the gas chambers, which is typical of what athletes are using. And I think just one point to make here on the right-hand side is that when we talk about muscle temperature, this is muscle temperature at depth of 3 centimeters below the surface or below the subcutaneous tissue. So this is really deep down in the muscle. Okay, we're not talking about superficial temperature here. So we can see a difference of, you know, approaching probably about 1.5 degrees when we compare the two. So cold water immersion is really effective at dropping tissue temperature. What about inflammation? Well, many obviously clinicians in the forum this morning will be aware that certainly over the years and decades now that, you know, there's been a lot of discussion around cooling, and one of the key mechanisms that it's purported to influence is inflammation. And a lot of this information has actually been drawn from animal studies where they've used really aggressive protocols to damage the muscle, and then looked at how a really aggressive application of cooling moderates the inflammatory response. And there's a lot of evidence to support that. But transferring that really excessive damaged or injury model to a model where athletes are actually just experiencing mild to moderate damage from exercise is very, very different. And actually, when you look in the literature, there's very, very few high-quality studies that have actually looked at inflammatory responses in the context of human skeletal muscle. And I would say today, this paper from Jonathan Peake's group in Australia now published 3 or 4 years ago, in Journal of Physiology, is probably the best study to date. And what they actually showed that when you induce some damage using resistance exercise, so in this case, squatting exercise, when you compare cooling of the limb with cold water versus active recovery, so for example, you know, cycling on an ergometer, when you look at inflammation within the muscle, so we're not talking systemic inflammation markers, so in the blood markers, for example, we're talking directly in the skeletal muscle. And when you look at different areas of that, whether it's cell infiltration, so your neutrophils, your macrophages, which obviously surge into the muscle when it's damaged, some of the key control signaling pathways, cytokines, heat shock proteins, which are obviously important in moderating protection for the cells. There was no difference between whether it was active recovery or cooling. So actually what we've seen from this study is that from an inflammatory perspective within the muscle itself, we actually don't really see any big impact of cold water immersion in terms of moderating inflammation. But I think where we probably do start to see, or certainly in the case of more systemic markers, or let's call it clinical markers of inflammation, in this case, DOMS or delayed onset muscle soreness, one of the most consistent responses we see in the literature is that when you apply cooling or cold water immersion following damaging exercise, be it eccentric exercise or high intensity exercise, different kinds of exercise, what we consistently see really is that cold water immersion will reduce DOMS. So we seem to see this analgesic effect, and certainly in my own experience over the years of discussing and working with athletes and coaches in different sports, it's pretty consistent that the athletes will report that the level of DOMS are significantly reduced when you use cooling. So we see some more systemic clinical inflammatory changes rather than maybe within the muscle. And the same also applies for muscle swelling. There are some studies, and here's just one example, again from Jonathan Peake's group, where they've applied cold water immersion versus active recovery. And over the 6 hours following exercise, there were some small reductions in actual limb volume. So in this particular instance, they measured limb circumference as an indirect measure of muscle swelling, and found some small reductions in limb swelling when you compared the cooling without it. So collectively, from an inflammatory perspective, we see, rather than maybe directly within the localized skeletal muscle, we see more general systemic changes in inflammation with cooling. There's also been a lot of work over the years in terms of looking at the nervous system, and here's just some data from Hani, who currently works with our national team. And this came from his PhD work with Martin Boucher. And there's been a lot of work that shows that if you subject athletes to cooling following exercise, you see some quite significant changes in parasympathetic reactivation. So effectively what's happening is that when you look at some measures such as heart rate variability and heart rate recovery, which over the years have been shown to relate to positive adaptation in training and in some cases performance, you see a real amplification of some of these measures. And here's an example of a measure of heart rate variability, where following exercise, when they applied cooling, you had this significant increase in parasympathetic reactivation. And there's some literature which suggests that they feel that the general positive perceptions of recovery that athletes get from immersing in cryotherapy is maybe linked to this parasympathetic reactivation. So we've seen some changes in autonomic functioning following exercise with cooling. So if we try to summarize that, really what we're seeing with cooling is we're seeing some significant changes in tissue temperature. We're seeing some more systemic inflammatory changes such as swelling and reduced delayed onset muscle soreness, and we're seeing some alterations in the nervous system that would come together collectively to maybe offer some insights into why we see some enhanced recovery in terms of performance with cold water immersion. The other area, which is what I want to really focus on for the next 20-25 minutes or so, is the perfusion or the blood flow responses. So this really links to the second learning objectives in terms of muscle perfusion. And so when we talk about muscle perfusion and what I'll talk about over the next few slides from some of our research, it's important to kind of have some backdrop to how we assess blood flow. And I think the starting point is that there's two key areas. One is more regional flow. So if we look on the left-hand side here, for example, the superficial femoral artery, which is what we focused on, they give you more regional insights in terms of blood entering, obviously, the lower limb in this case. But there's also ways of looking at more local blood flow around the muscle bed itself. So what we refer to as you'll know, as kind of like microvascular flow. So once we move away from the bigger arteries and we move towards kind of the capillary beds and the arterioles and the venules. So there's two sides to measuring blood flow which are important. We've got the regional, which is the bigger vessels, and then the more microvascular flow. And it'll be important as we go through that we kind of remember this terminology. So, you know, over the years, there's been a lot of work looking at, you know, ways that we can measure blood flow from a regional. So if you look at the top end of this slide here, and I do apologize that I can't use the pointer, and unfortunately, Keynote is not compatible with the way that the cursor that you can use here in Microsoft Teams. So at the top, 5 or 6 techniques around regional flow, and at the bottom we've got ways to measure local flow. And in the work that I'm going to talk to you about now, we principally used high resolution ultrasound Doppler to measure quantitative estimates of blood flow into the femoral artery. So from a regional perspective, the superficial femoral artery, we're able to derive real-time quantitative measures of the amount of blood coming into the artery. And we're really fortunate that at the time of this research, we had a really highly experienced sonographer. And we also had some guys who've actually developed some customized edge detection software. And you can see here the software. What that effectively allows us to detect is the velocity of the blood going through the artery, which you can see at the bottom. And at the top, you can see the edge detection software, which is actually detecting the diameter of the vessel. So clearly, once you have the diameter of the vessel, you have the velocity of the blood, you can then compute blood flow in the artery. So this ultrasound Doppler technique is something we used extensively. And certainly from, assuming you have the right expertise, it's probably in this type of research, the most effective tool that we have to measure regional blood flow. So that's how we were measuring femoral artery flow in some of the work I'll talk to you about. And over the last few years, we've done a number of studies to try and look at what, you know, this blood flow response to cooling. And really our model, as you can see here, both in rest and exercise, has been to basically pair two important measures. One has been femoral artery blood flow, which is what you've just seen, and the other using laser Doppler flow, which is just some small Doppler flow parameters which you put onto the skin surface, which allows you to basically measure the relative changes in skin blood flow. So from our perspective, we were measuring skin blood flow in the limb, we were measuring flow into the limb with Doppler ultrasound. And so by using those two, we felt we could get some insight into what potentially was happening in terms of blood flow in the limb, okay? Because certainly at rest, we know that blood flow into the bone and into subcutaneous tissue is pretty negligible. So the majority of flow into the actual limb itself is going to the skin and the muscle. So by measuring arterial flow and skin flow, we get a good idea as to what's happening around the muscle itself. And here's an example of two studies that we did. The left-hand side is the rest, and the one on the right is exercise. And I'm going to focus more on the post-exercise study, but I will come back to some information around skin blood flow in the resting study, because it's really important in terms of understanding what's happening. But these two studies were very similar in that we used two kind of practical ways of using cold water immersion, which essentially was a 10-minute block, 2 5-minute periods with a 2-minute rest, 8 degrees C and 22 degrees C water. So really cool. And then something that more really reflects kind of tap water temperature. And at different points, we'd measure things like femoral artery blood flow, the muscle temperature, and skin blood flow, etc. And we did exactly the same with the exercise one. But obviously, what we did before we did that is we preceded it with a bout of exercise. So what I'm going to show you now is just some of the data in the exercise trial. And so here what you can see is the thigh skin temperature. So the blue line is the really cold water, the red line is the 22 degree, and the white line is the control condition. And obviously across the bottom you can see the different time periods. We've got pre-immersion, then we've got the values immediately post-immersion, and then at 10, 20 and 30 minutes following immersion. And clearly it's easy to see here that the more cooler water you use, the bigger reduction in thigh skin temperature you're going to get. And that's been consistent in pretty much all the literature. The cooler the water, the bigger the drop in skin temperature. So that's a pretty easy picture to see. Here we've got muscle temperature. So again, this is 3 centimeters. This is a depth of 3 centimeters. So really deep muscle temperature. What I would say at this point is we also have data for 2 or 1 centimeter. And what I can say is that the magnitude of the change in temperature obviously is bigger, the shallower the depth. So more towards the skin surface, you'll see much bigger drops in the temperature. And also the difference between the control and the cooling temperatures get bigger. But if we just focus on this particular point here, I think there's 2 really important points to take from this. One is clearly, again, that the cooler the water, the bigger the drop in muscle temperature you typically get. Okay, so the blue line again is more exacerbated rather than the red line. But what I want you to take note of here, because we'll come back to this, is something that's really important and often missed both particularly in practice, is that the post-immersion values you can see here, the muscle temperature, were taken immediately following the immersion. But look what happens when we ask the participants to exit the water and literally just sit around, okay, in the room where the immersion was done. So they're outside of the water. The legs remain wet, okay, so we don't dry the legs. The biggest reduction you can see in muscle temperature actually occurs post-immersion, okay? So what's really important here is that if a drop in muscle temperature is a really important driver for mediating the effects of cooling, then actually the biggest return on your investment, or pain, let's call it, from going in the cold water, is by actually hanging around for another 30 minutes or so to let that continue to drop, okay? And so obviously there's a lot of physiology, going on to explain that, but effectively what's happening is we're seeing more and more heat transfer from the deep musculature to the surface, okay? The heat is being drawn out of the muscle, which is then explaining why we're seeing a big drop in deep muscle temperature. So this is really important, and we'll come back to this. But the message here is if you really want to accelerate your muscle drop, keep the legs wet and keep the guys cool for as long as you possibly can. Here is the femoral artery flow. In this case, it's called artery conductance, but effectively this is the blood flow controlled for blood pressure. And what you can see here is that, compared with the control, we saw a big drop in the obviously femoral artery flow in both of the cooling conditions, and there wasn't really, the level of drop was very similar between the two cooling conditions. So again, here we're pretty much what we hypothesize is that when you apply cold water immersion, you get a big drop in flow into the limb, in this regional inflow into the limb, in this case femoral artery blood flow. So what does, and sorry, just before we move on, here's the skin blood flow. So again, when you look at the cooling, in this case, we're looking at skin blood flow on the thigh. So this would have been a Doppler probe on the thigh. You see a big drop in blood flow to the skin, okay, to the cutaneous circulation. Okay, so how can we summarize that? So if we look in the table at the top here, what we can see is that typically when you compare 8, so really cold water with moderately cold water, femoral flow is actually pretty similar. So from a statistical perspective, it was pretty similar. Skin blood flow was pretty similar. And the muscle temperature was obviously a further, dropped to a greater degree. So if we bring all this together, effectively, what we were suggesting from this, given that we had a similar femoral and skin blood flow, is that muscle blood flow would be similar. Okay, so no matter how cold the water is, muscle blood flow, based on these indirect measures we postulated, would be similar. So probably the only benefit in this case of really having really cold water would be have a much bigger drop in muscle temperature. So that's the kind of message that we take from this particular type of study. This has been consistent in other studies as well that we've done. So using these indirect measures at the moment, we would potentially suggest that muscle blood flow might not be that different, okay, when you change the water temperature. Here is some of the skin blood flow data that we took at rest. And what's really interesting about the study at rest is that what we found in this instance, you can see that it looks like the skin blood flow data in the coldest water is actually higher, okay? So this is different to the previous slide I showed you following exercise, where the blue line would have been below the red line. And what actually you find at rest, because obviously they haven't exercised and the body is at a much lower level of temperature, we get what's called this cold-induced vasodilation. And simply what this is the body's way of trying to protect the skin from being damaged from the cold. Okay, so what happens is when the body's much cooler at rest, when you then put them in really cold water, you actually get this cold-induced vasodilation. You get an increase in blood flow in the skin as the body tries to protect the skin from getting too cold. So actually blood flow is reversed. It's actually increased in the really cold water. Okay, so what does that mean? So, well, at rest, what we've seen then, if we have a similar femoral artery flow, but we have higher skin blood flow, what this could mean is actually, as a consequence of that, maybe the flow to the muscle is lower in really cold water because the blood flow is being rediverted to the skin. So that was a hypothesis we had, that maybe at rest, and that might be relevant to some of the clinicians here today, because maybe you use these types of interventions, cold water, when the athlete's more in a rested state rather than immediately post-competition. It could be that really cold water promotes a better reduction in muscle blood flow because of its effects in the skin. But that was just some ideas we had because this was the limitations of the measures. What we were fortunate to do over the last few years, due to an AZF research grant, is to have some money to really collaborate with one of the world's leading research centres using positron emission tomography. And this is based, it's really a research centre in Turku in Finland that do a lot of work in disease states where they need to look at muscle metabolism and blood flow. And we were able to collaborate with these guys to really use the gold standard technique for looking at flow, local flow, remember, within the muscle. So if I remember, I said we talked about regional flow, local flow. In this case, what a PET scan can do is allow you to really quantify very detailed way the blood flow going through the muscle bed. So we were able to do this with the guys in Finland. We somehow managed to convince them that it would be a really good idea in a room with a $10 million scanner, that we put a big paddling pool full of cold water and we dump a few people in it. I think my negotiation skills were pretty good, but we managed to do that. And so here you can see one of our subjects just about to go into the PET scanner. And so in this situation, he'd have been cooled in water, and we were looking then at what's actually happening at the muscle bed. And what you can see at the bottom here is some cross-sectional CT images of the upper limb. And so if you look in the middle, you can see clearly in the middle, for those of you really familiar with this types of scans, you can see the femur in the middle, the white dot. And then as you move out from there, you can actually see the individual quadriceps. So obviously on the left, on the outside, we've got the lateralis. And then we've obviously towards the other side, we have the medialis. And we have the vastus intermedialis there around the femur, and with the rectus femoris at the top. So we've got the superficial kind of quads on the outside, and then the two deeper quadricep muscles at the bottom towards the femur. And on the right-hand side, effectively, what you can do is you can then merge let's call it the structural scan from the CT scanner. You can overlay that then with the imaging power from the PET scan, and then you can start to quantify the blood flow in very detailed way in each actual individual muscle. And obviously those familiar with PETs will know that to do this, they have to infuse a radioisotope tracer, and it's the image then, it's the scanner that actually then detects the blood flow through tracking the actual isotope itself. So it's obviously an incredibly technical and advanced way to do this, and obviously we were reliant on a whole raft of technicians and researchers at the institute to do this for us. That's really amazing technology. And they've actually applied this previously once in a study of heating, but this was the first study ever done in human skeletal muscle looking at the influence of blood flow changes in response to cooling. So we're really fortunate to be able to do this. And this really is the study design we adopted. We did basically because of the ethical restraints in terms of the number of scans that you can expose subjects to, and also the very invasive nature of this work. Obviously, you have to put lines into the arm, you have to infuse tracers. It's very, very difficult to do repeated measures design. So in this instance, we did both an exercise study and a resting study, a little bit like we did previously that I showed you, but we had three separate groups of subjects. In the exercise study on the left, as you can see, we had one group do 10 minutes of cold water immersion at 8 degrees and 22, like we previously did, and we also had a group midway at 15 degrees. So we would basically immerse them in these temperatures, and then we would check, obviously, the different measures and obviously the blood flow measures following that. And then after a prolonged rest, we had the group then do some cycling like we did in the previous study. So we'd regulate the body's temperature to a controlled level of 38 degrees C. And then we would do the same like we previously did after exercise. We would immerse them, in this case in 8 and 22 degrees. And we also had a control condition. And then we would scan them again. So we could see what was happening at rest, and we could see what was happening post-exercise, just like we previously did with the more indirect measures based on skin blood flow and arterial inflow. So this is some of the data that we managed to publish recently in JAP. And here what you can see is basically the perfusion in the quadriceps. So in independence of the individual quadricep muscles, this was just purely the quadriceps as a whole. And what's important to know at this stage is the way we interpreted this data is based on the expertise in Finland. We based on their background and different studies, we basically set a clinically important change in perfusion of 0.75. So 0.75 mils per 100 grams of muscle tissue per minute, they deemed as clinically important. And what I mean by that is that in some of the disease studies and populations, if they see a change of 0.75 in flow into the muscle, that could have some clinical implications. So we adopted that threshold, and the dotted line above and below zero here is that threshold. So in order for us to detect what we would call, let's call it a clinically important change in perfusion, we would need our values to sit outside, obviously below this range. So what you can see here is the mean and 95% confidence interval changes at 8, 15 and 22 degrees. And so by definition, we didn't see any reduction in global perfusion because, as you can see here, the the 95% confidence interval, the upper limit, is still inside this 0.75 zone, yeah? So for us to see a change, you'd have to have that upper 95% confidence interval below the dotted line. So we didn't see any global reduction. So overall, there was no significant drop in flow inside the entire quad muscle, okay? And that's the first time this has ever been shown. But what about when we look at the individual muscles? So if we then break it down into the two more superficial muscles, which is the rectus femoris and the vastus lateralis, they're more superficially located muscles, as you know. And then we have the deeper intermedius and medialis. But what we did see here in 8 degrees C is that in the really deep vastus intermedius, you can see the green line sits outside the shaded zone. So we actually saw an increase, a clinically important increase in perfusion in the really deep muscle in the really cold water. At the opposite spectrum, if you look at 15 degrees C, if you look at the blue and the black lines, which are the femoris and the lateralis, you can see that they were starting to approach, they were starting to move below this, this zone. So we were starting to see a move towards a clinically important reduction in flow in these more superficial muscles. So really interesting that we don't see an overall global change, but we see individual muscle changes with an increase in the deeper muscles and a reduction in the more superficial muscles. And in exactly the same way, here is the exercise data. Okay, so very similar way. But what we did see here, if you look on the right-hand side, in the 22 degrees water, which is obviously not too cool, we saw a clinically important reduction in global perfusion. So following exercise, where obviously the blood flow is going to be high, no surprise we see a big drop in global perfusion with cooling, which is a little bit different to the resting state. And again, if we look at the individual muscle groups, if you just look at the center figure here, which is the 8 degrees, so really cold water versus the control. What you can see here again is that in the more in the more superficial tissues, the femoris and the lateralis, you can see a practically important change in blood flow. So these superficial tissues, the blood flow is starting to come down in them, okay? So that's pretty similar to what we also saw at rest. On the right-hand side, you can also see a similar pattern with the 22 degrees C, where the femoris and the lateralis are starting to approach meaningful reductions. Interestingly, compared with the rest, what we didn't see in this study in the center is in the deeper muscles, the intermedius and the medialis, we didn't see that really significant increase in perfusion like we did at rest. And again, that could be because the body's operating at a higher temperature following exercise. So if we try to summarize this really contemporary information, then at rest, what we can say is that we don't see a change in global perfusion at rest, but what we do see is an increase in perfusion in the deeper muscles in really cold water, whereas in moderately cool water, we see a decrease in the superficial perfusion. If we then look at post-exercise, what we can see is we do see with cooler water a decrease in overall quadriceps perfusion. And we also see more superficial reductions, which would make sense. So we've seen slightly different changes at rest and exercise, but a common theme seems to be here that with really aggressive cooling, we're seeing an increase in perfusion in the deep muscles. And we think this again comes back to the body's protective mechanism, because there's been some fabulous work done over the years that's looked at the shivering response deep in the muscle tissue. And we see this increase in shivering response like we do at the surface with EMG when the body starts to get really cold. So even though we didn't measure EMG at a deep level in the muscles, because it's a really difficult technique to do, with the blood flow would seem to align with that we're seeing this protective effect. In really cold water, we're getting an increase in perfusion. So I think what we can do, if we try to confirm this data with what we did with the earlier work, is that it would seem that this big reduction in flow into the artery seems to predominantly reflect a reduction in flow to the skin, to the superficial quadriceps muscle or the superficial muscle tissue, and maybe into other tissues such as the subcutaneous level. What it's not reflecting is a drop in muscle perfusion in the really deep quadriceps tissue. That's not happening. And that's the first time this has been shown in human skeletal muscle. So what I've shown you there pretty quickly is a bit of a run through some of the recent work that we've done in blood flow, and certainly some of the most contemporary work in skeletal muscle blood flow from the PET scan. So as always, how can we apply that then into the real world? So what I want to just kind of finish with over the next 5 or 10 minutes is just trying to make a little bit of sense of that and bring it into our world as well as practitioners as to how we might take advantage of it. And when we look at a lot of the literature, even today, despite the fact I showed you at the beginning that pretty much every football club, as an example in football, is using cold water immersion, we still actually lack some clear guidelines in terms of prescription. And part of this confusion, I think, comes from the fact that in the research we've used so many different types of exercise, huge variations in temperatures, the duration and the timing of it. So all these factors have been massively varied, which makes it really difficult to try and get some consensus in terms of, okay, what's a dose response relationship between these variables and, for example, some of the data I've showed you. And clearly some of the limitations on that are cost and other things of using apparatus such as PET scans, which we need to understand the mechanism better. But I think what we can say is that it's clear it's a balance between two key drivers. One is tissue temperature, which is the number one priority. It's the key driver. But we also have to factor in blood flow to some extent, because we know that clearly inflammatory aspects such as swelling and edema, etc., are an important mechanism involved in inflammatory response. So we have to be careful that we also factor in both of these aspects, because as I've just shown you, we are seeing differences in muscle blood flow which happen as a consequence of different degrees of cooling. The problem is, as I've said, is there's such a lack of clinical and mechanistic research that have manipulated these variables using quality measures that I've just referred to that give us some idea around tissue and skeletal blood flow. But if we try to get some idea, let's call it common sense based on what we know, then if we think about temperature, duration and frequency in terms of guidelines, then immediately post-exercise, maybe what we can do is look to immerse people as cold as possible. So as soon as the players finish the games, if we have access to cooling, to cold water immersion, which most elite teams do, let's hit them hard. Because the body is already warm, it's still going to be elevated in terms of metabolic rate. So I think we can afford to hit them hard, okay, maybe 5 to 15 minutes of really cold water, maybe less than 10 degrees C, depending on the tolerance. Clearly, rugby players' tolerance is probably going to be higher than some of our beloved soccer players. So maybe we can hit them really hard, okay, because we're not going to see the problems of increasing deep muscle flow, as I've shown you, because the body's a little bit warmer. So maybe we can hit them hard, but also not forgetting the fact that when they come out of the water, let's not go straight into the shower. Let's not dry the limbs and warm them. Let's leave the muscles to cool for 20 or 30 minutes while they're sat in the changing rooms, while they're drinking and eating as they start the recovery process. Okay, let's keep the limbs cool, because as I've shown you, you get a huge reduction in muscle temperature in that window, which could be driving our ability to reduce symptoms of swelling and delayed onset of muscle soreness, which are going to affect perception of recovery. So hit them hard is the message immediately after exercise. However, in the days following the game, so if you think during the Arab Cup, they're going to be playing a game every 4 or 5 days. In the days following that, it may be that we're applying cold water immersion in a rested state. Maybe clinicians who are using cryotherapy are applying it in a rested state. So as we know, if the body is cooler, then it may be better to not be as aggressive, maybe to use water temperatures of 15 degrees C or above that still drop the muscle temperature, but not to the extent that we might get this cold-induced vasodilation in the muscle that starts to increase flow in the deep muscle tissue. So that would be my take on this, in that maybe, the two key messages here, based on what we know from a mechanistic perspective, is hit them hard immediately after exercise if they're warmer, but maybe we don't need to hit them as hard at a resting state to get a more balanced temperature response and blood flow response. One of the problems I think with the latter, as I've said here, is that how practical is is applying cold water immersion. So because we know really to benefit from it, one bout is not going to be sufficient. We need to repeatedly apply this. And some really interesting information, which we don't have time to go into now, but I would advise anyone interested in this to go and have a look at some of this work from Glyn Howatson's group, is some of this phase change material. And effectively, phase change material is where you apply, it's almost like a cold pack, which you can see on the left. And then over a number of hours, which this can be applied, as it changes from a solid state to liquid, its ability to absorb heat is really potent. And some of the work that Glyn's guys have shown is that over 3 to 6 hours, if you apply these packs on the muscles, you get a really nice ability to keep the muscle temperature down over a prolonged period of time. So it's not really aggressive, but what it does do is it continues to bring the temperature down over a long period of time. So it could be that a hybrid solution is something we can use in the future, where we hit the athlete hard after exercise with an aggressive cold water stimulus, and then in the subsequent period, okay, or in the hours after the game, or in the subsequent days, maybe we can apply some of this phase change material that gives us a more prolonged stimulus. And I certainly think going forward, this is some of the work we need to do now, which is these hybrid solutions and looking at how they affect skeletal muscle temperature and blood flow. And so really that kind of brings the end to the talk. I think we're out of time. There's so many people I'd love to acknowledge specifically in this, but there'd be too many. I would like to acknowledge Chris Mawini, who was the postdoctoral student that drove a lot of this work in Turkey. I'd like to thank AZF for the research funding. Without them, the work wouldn't have been done. And obviously, I'd like to thank a number of the staff in Aspire Academy, and also in Liverpool, John Moores, the cardiovascular staff that were integral in doing this work. And that brings us to an end. Thanks for listening.